For many years, the Seiko 5 has been the unanimous recommendation for your first automatic watch. Dipping your toes into the hobby for a price that won't break the bank and offers quality, design and value that puts many other brands to shame. One of those in particular is the SNXS 79. I have that one myself and looked at it in a previous video. But has its place as the gold standard entry-level auto been usurped? Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we're looking at a watch that is going head-to-head with that Seiko SNXS 79 I mentioned in the intro. It's got some solid, everyday versatility in its looks, comes from their 5 range of watches, and, importantly, has a very similar colour dial. It's a colour that's maybe not as common as it should be, which I think is part of why the SNXS was so popular in the first place. This is the Seiko 5 SRPE51. Straight away, you can see the similarities. We'll do a bit of a comparison later, but first, let's take a look at the newer SRPE and let it stand on its own 2 feet. This watch comes from Seiko's reimagined 5 Sports collection and has been dubbed the Dresskx. That's because the shape of the case as well as the dial and hands can trace their origins back to the cult classic SKX 007 and 9 that are now discontinued. But swap out the diver's bezel for this smooth one, hence the dressy appearance. In addition to this colour, Seiko have also released a range of others, including black, blue, green, gilt, and even concrete. Like those Seiko 5s of old, as well as most modern Seikos, you won't be paying the RRP if you want one of these. Officially, these have a retail price of $295 US, but here in Australia, they are regularly on sale for under that number, even in Australian dollars. In comparison to the roughly $100 price of those older 5s, it's a bit of a jump up in price. So, when we compare them, we'll have to see whether that increase is justified. Coming back to this watch though, besides that striking grey sunburst dial, the design feels a bit like a Tudor Black Bay 36, probably another reason why I was so attracted to the design in the first place. It's got the dial markers and hands of a dive watch in a more everyday style case. It's also got enough polishing to let it fit in with pretty much anything except the most formal events. If we take a closer look at the dial, we can see just how dynamic that sunburst effect is. Depending on the light, it can change from a brilliant silver colour to a deep charcoal grey. I absolutely love this colour for dials, but don't really see that many of them around, especially at the budget end of the market. The dial itself is pretty simple and straightforward, with classic Seiko diver applied hour markers. We've got a triangle at 12 and ovals at 6 and 9. All other markers are circular except for 3, where we've got a cutout to display the day and date function of the watch. There is a nice bevel around this cutout, and the way it catches the light really eliminates any need for a printed or applied frame. Those markers are of course loomed with Seiko's LumiBrite and glow very well. Seiko, after all, has a reputation for their divers having great lume, and this watch has gotten some similar treatment. Above the pinion is an applied Seiko logo, as well as the new 5 symbol that looks a lot like a certain superhero. The design of this 5 was a bit divisive when it was first unveiled, but I think that these have been around long enough that people have either gotten used to it, or have gotten all their complaints out and moved on with their lives. Personally, I don't really care too much either way. I can tell you, when I look at this dial, that 5 is not where my eye is drawn to. Below the pinion is simply the word automatic printed in a cursive script. Overall, the dial is uncluttered and well balanced, without feeling too empty. Since there are only hours on the dial, we're relying on the chapter ring to help us get a good read of the time. It's grey to match the colour of the dial, and in true Seiko fashion, it looks like it's ever so slightly misaligned to the left. That's how you know it's a real Seiko. The difference is not really enough to bother me, and honestly, I didn't even notice it until I looked very closely at the watch for this review. The hands on this watch are loomed just like the dial, and pretty much the exact same ones as those on the original SKX. The minute hand has that arrow head, both have the syringe tip that matches the 12, 6 and 9 markers, and the second hand has a lollipop counterbalance that is also loomed. The only differences I can see are that the minute hand does not have the step in about halfway down, and they are overall a bit narrower. Otherwise, still very legible and still very Seiko in design. If you've seen the SKX, you'll pretty much know what to expect with this one. We've got a case size of right on 40mm, keeping it wearable for a wide range of wrist sizes. Lug to lug is kept very compact at just 44.6mm, and height is also pretty well managed at 12.7mm. Thankfully, the lug width is a standard 20mm, so you can swap it out easily for another strap. It's got sweeping curves, a short lug to lug, crown guards at 4 o'clock, and a pleasant mix of brushed and polishing. As I mentioned before, the dive bezel has been replaced by a polished one that does not turn, and it's got the neat little feature of having 3 different surfaces to catch and play with the light, even more than a standard bezel might. The top surface of the lugs are brushed and transition into those polished sides and crown guards. Another nice little detail is the fact that the lugs have been drilled to make strap changing very easy. Looking from the side here still, we can see a somewhat oversized crown that looks appropriate given the rest of the design. It unfortunately does not screw down, but the watch still manages to maintain a decent 100 meters of water resistance. It's not signed either, of course, but we've come to expect that from Seiko at this price. What does screw down is the display caseback that gives you a bit of a look at the movement inside. It's a budget Seiko automatic watch, so of course it's going to have the 4R36 movement. You should know all about it by now. It hacks, it hand winds, it's got a day and date complication, and it beats at 3 Hz or 6 times per second. It's robust and reliable, which is exactly what you would want in a watch like this, and out of all the watches I've had with this movement or the 4R35, none have ever really given me any grief. There is one last thing to talk about. I've kind of avoided it until now, and you can probably see why. That's the bracelet. And this one has seen some things. Both of those end links are warped and a little bit out of shape. But let's just pretend they're not. It is a budget watch, so the bracelet feels pretty hollow. That's probably because it is. The end links are hollow, and the links themselves are also hollow. Seiko have been doing this for a long time, and they've had a lot of practice. So they've actually gotten pretty good at it. You might not even realize that the links are folded unless you look closely and notice this seam running down the side of the link. To their credit, the bracelet feels solid, and on wrist, I don't notice a difference compared to other ones. The links themselves are 3-piece links, and, like the case, are brushed on top and polished on the side. Overall, I like the bracelet, and I think that it suits the watch quite well. Coming to the clasp, there are no surprises here either. It's pressed and a little bit flimsy, but it does the job. The Seiko logo has been stamped into the security fold over, and there are 2 positions of micro adjustment. Now let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. I've got to admit, I went back and forth on this watch. When it was first announced, I didn't pay too much attention to it. Then, the more I looked at it, the more it grew on me. Eventually I saw one in person, and when I first tried it on, I didn't like the way it wore. It felt a bit flat and like it sat too high on top of my wrist, rather than conforming to the shape. However, I persevered and eventually I came to really like it. So, tell me what you think and how it wears on my wrist. The short lug to lug and relatively slim height help the way it wears, and it's quite comfortable. As I turn my wrist, you can also see the dial really change with that sunburst texture. Changing up the straps, we can put it on some brown leather where I think it works really well. Those 2 colours in combination really pick each other out. Some other models in this range come on NATO straps as standard, and this beige one in my opinion also works really well on the watch. Okay, we've looked at the watch in isolation now, but let's give it some context, namely the SNXS S79. Of course, they have their differences stylistically, but in my head, these are also kind of competing against each other in this budget, grey sunburst dial everyday watch space. Which one is better? Well, in terms of design, it's subjective. I do like the resemblance to the Black Bay, another watch I really like, but there is just something about the SNXS that does it for me. I think it has a bit more character than the SRPE. Where the SRPE has some similarities to a Tudor watch, the SNXS of course has some to a Rolex one. In terms of pretty much every measurable aspect of these watches though, the new SRPE is equal to or better than the older SNXS. The lume is much better, the finishing on the case is leagues ahead, We went over the mix of brushed and polished surfaces earlier. Whereas, the SNXS is completely polished. The bracelets are incomparable. Yes, they're both folded, but the one on this SNXS is light, jangly, and always threatening to pull some arm hair out. However, on the SRPE, it's better integrated into the design of the case, and doesn't feel at all like the old one. The brushing and polishing pattern matches the case. On the SNXS, we've got a fully polished case paired with a brushed bracelet. Water resistance has also been improved from 50 to 100 meters on the newer watch. The SRPE also wins when it comes to the movement. The 6R35 hacks and hand winds, something that the 7S26 doesn't. But, at least to me, the older Seiko 5 has got more character. There is something I can't quite put into words that draws me to the SNXS. Maybe it is because of the shortcomings of the watch that actually make it more endearing. Maybe it's because I've had it longer, or maybe it's because it was also cheaper, at about half the price of the SRPE. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but given a choice between the two, I'm pretty sure I'm leaning towards the SNXS. That said, I also think you can't go wrong with the SRPE if it's going to be your first automatic watch. It's a watch that can more or less do it all, and I think the improvements over the original more than justify the difference in price. Ultimately, it comes down to which one calls to you. That indescribable reason that you can't stop thinking about one over the other. For you, it might be the SRPE, but for me, it's the SNXS. What do you think about this watch? Which one is calling your name? Have you got one of these SRPE watches in your collection? What do you think of the updated 5 logo? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.